Well, welcome everybody to our plot to diversify the world, I guess, of teen literature, because the world is already diversified. I'm Natalie McCall. I'm the teen librarian here at the Albany Library. I want to start by thanking the Friends of the Library. They are sponsoring this event, and they sponsor my teen book club and middle school book club and make it possible for me to pay for all the cool things that I get to do. And I want to thank everyone who helped me with this. I want to thank Mary from the Dublin Library. She did a lot of work getting the authors here. And my boss, Brian Edwards, he's not here, but he got us the pizza. And yeah, so thanks to him for that. All right, so one of our authors had to cancel NH Senzai. She had a family emergency. So we have a bit of a lineup change, which actually turned out to be really cool. Jorjie, one of my book club members, hopped on. So we're going to have a teen voice up here, which will make things better, I think. She's just a savant who's already has some teen novels under her belt. Nice. Hey, so we've talked about this a bit for people who have been here all day. It's about the word diversity. It's a pretty tricky word to pin down and define, because the more you limit its boundaries, the more you leave people out. But we need to work with something. So I'm stealing the definition that has been come up with by the group called We Need Diverse Books. They're a nonprofit that wants to, get more diverse books for teenagers. So their definition includes LGBTQIA, people of color, gender diversity, people with disabilities, and ethnic, cultural, and religious minorities. So that includes a lot, but it is tricky. I know that I still haven't pinned down my own identity as a diverse person, and I'm over the age of 30, and I'm still trying to figure that out. Growing up, when I was in the mood to be simple about it, I called myself biracial. Black dad, white mom, poofy hair, boom, that's me, and as few words as possible, when I wasn't in the mood to kind of just list out everything and make it hard. But growing up in the Bay Area, mecca of diversity that it is, I was still used to being the only person in a room that looked like me. Maybe one of two if my sister was there. So for a long time, my sister was the only mirror that I had. Lucky for me, she was smart and cool and pretty, so it made me feel like the whole biracial thing was good. She was a great mirror. And I can say this because she's not in the room, otherwise. Otherwise, she would be living on that for a long time. So mirrors are important. I've heard a lot this year in discussions about diversity in teen literature that young people need mirrors. If they don't see reflections of themselves in the books they read, they start to think of themselves as invisible or monstrous or unreal. And I've also heard the word windows used quite a bit. Readers need a peek into the lives of people that are different than them, people with different backgrounds and experiences and thoughts. It makes, the other, the unknown other, seem visible and human and real. Now, window reading is what I'm used to. From the first books I read on my own as a poofy-haired kid, up to the book I read this morning, which was Tim Floreen's book here. And it's a wonderful experience. Window reading is awesome. For anybody who's worried about it, it's great. But whenever I try to remember a time of reading a mirror book, I come up empty. Close a time or two, but empty. And I've read so many books and looked really hard, purposely looked for books that are mirror books. I've experienced the mirror feeling once from a piece of, let's say, storytelling. Not from a book, but from a movie. And I saw a woman that was constantly pulled between worlds, reaching for one while the other was tugging on her. She was sincere and sarcastic. You can see I'm both of those things. She was hopeful and cynical, but she was never, ever tragic. She lived her life every day and kept on with it. And I got so excited seeing her. I was like, this is it. This is real. I exist. I can point to this and not myself as, this is what I'm like. So mirrors and windows are both beautiful. And I can't go back in time and give my high school self books with more diversity of experience and thought, but I can do my small part to give all the young people in this room and younger ones books that they can recognize themselves in and then see other people in as well. And so I think with all of the writers and readers and librarians in this room, we can, make that happen or start to make that happen. So first we're going to chat with our panelists, just kind of talk about this, what we're dealing with here. And then at the end, we're all going to get together and we're going to plot. We're going to come up with things that we can all do to make this happen. So I'm going to just kind of introduce the panelists, but let them talk about themselves however they want to, and then start with the hard cracking questions that we're all come up with by my teen book club came up with all the questions, so they're not mine. I'll start with Tim Floreen.
Hi, my name's Tim, and I have 2 young adult books, one out now, one about to come out, both of which feature a gay teen protagonist. The one that's out right now is called Willful Machines, and it's about, it takes place in the near future, and it's about the son of the US president who discovers he's been targeted for elimination by a malevolent artificial intelligence. And it's a lot of fun. And the one that's coming out this October is called Tattoo Atlas. It's a little bit darker. It's about a sociopathic school shooter who receives an experimental brain surgery intended to cure him of his violent impulses. And his classmate, who may or may not have been one of the shooter's intended victims, and who now has to decide whether he can trust him or not. And so both of them are told from a gay teen point of view, and they're both kind of science fiction thrillers. So although the main character is gay, they're not specifically about the experience of being gay. That's all for now.
Hi, my name is Mariko Tamaki. I am evidently Canadian. I feel like that's evident. So there's some diversity there. I'm Japanese Canadian and a homosexual, so homosexual power. I have been writing plays and books and comic books for, I guess, like the last 15 years or so. I started off writing as part of a lot of queer cabarets that took place when I was a young teen and early 20-year-old writer. So I've written essays and sort of humorous essays and stuff like that. But more recently, I have been writing comic books, and the 2 that I think I'm best known for are the ones that I wrote with my cousin Jillian Tamaki, which is Skim, which is the story about this gay teen in a Toronto high school who falls in love with her English teacher. That's the shortest summary I can think of that book. And This One Summer, which is the story about these 2 girls who are at the cottage. And that's really all that book is about. That's it. But curiously, This One Summer was also just banned in Florida and Minnesota. So obviously there's something about 2 girls, discovering just the things you discover as a young girl at the cottage that's really upsetting to people in Florida and Minnesota.
Now you all really want to read it.
Yeah, exactly. And I also write young adult fiction. So Saving Montgomery Soul is my most recent YA book, and it's a book about a girl who lives in a small town in Southern California who is the only person in her school who has lesbian moms, and it's about kind of being the square peg in a small town. And yeah, I think diversity is pretty important as an embodiment of it. So I'm really excited to hear what we all want to say about that.
Hi, I am not NH Senzai. My name is Jorjie. I'm a teen who attends this library, which I guess qualifies me enough to be among these 2 authors with multiple published books. And Natalie, would you like to?
Oh, you guys hang on to the mic.
I can hold it.
You ready for
Yeah.
Yeah, and she's hoarding chocolate.
Yeah, and there's all kinds of chocolate up here, but it's hidden.
Okay, there's more chocolate in the back if you guys get a hankering for it, and also popcorn. I like to bribe people with food. Okay, so our first question is a 2-parter. The first part is, did you grow up in a very diverse area? And then, if yes, how did this influence your writing? And if no, how did you learn about other cultures and people?
I grew up in Toronto, Canada, which is in and of itself actually a pretty diverse city. And I'm actually really proud of Toronto and the diversity that is in Toronto. And I miss having rotis there all the time. But in my school, I was it wasn't a very diverse place. And I was definitely, I didn't actually know for the longest time that I was Japanese Canadian. I just thought that I had a father who was much hairier in a different way than most of my friends. And I really just didn't know anything about race. Like, my mother is white and my dad is Japanese, and we just kind of did that thing. Like, we had chopsticks and none of my other friends had chopsticks, but nobody ever really verbalized it for me. And actually, the Japanese Canadians were interned during World War II, which I didn't even find out until I studied it in grade 9 history. And then I came home and I was like, please explain. This is us? My dad was like, yeah, that's not a big deal. So I have a very weird, I think I sort of, in the same way I was sort of discovering that I was gay as a kid, I was really discovering my own sort of cultural history at the same time. And I think a lot of the things that I'm interested in are things where that is not necessarily cut and dry. Like you, it's like how you explain yourself as being someone who's just not like the other people in your class. I think it is, it becomes more curious because it's less obvious, I think. And so for me, it's never been about the sort of like, I'm super proud and want to read more about Japanese Canadians as it is that I'm interested in anybody who's, anybody from like a superhero to like a 12-year-old girl who's trying to figure out who they are. And so that's definitely been like my literary focus.
So I moved around a little bit when I was a kid. I lived in Minnesota until I was 9, which evidently has its issues. Okay. Oh, it was only banned from a tiny part. Okay. Well, it'll. And then we moved to Northern California, and I lived in Pleasanton for a couple years, and then we moved to Modesto. And I see lots of nods in the audience. Modesto is reasonably diverse, but definitely very conservative. And it's not the greatest place to grow up, or it wasn't, I should say, when I was there, the greatest place to grow up as an LGBT teen. And, we were talking before this started, and it definitely gives you some fodder for writing, growing up in an environment like that. But by the time I was a senior in high school, I was like, I had come out to myself by that point, and I was like, okay, I know I'm gay, but there's no way that I'm coming out here, so I'll just wait until I leave, and then I'll come out, and that's what I did. It wasn't easy growing up there, but at least I've kept in touch with a lot of my friends from there, and I feel like a lot of the bonds that I made there continue to be very important to me. So I don't want to speak too badly of the place either. I think that's all I have to say for now.
I think another thing to say is that I really think that there is a power in growing up different because you don't take anything for granted. Like, I think that if you, for me, it's like prom, or what do you guys call it? You guys call it prom here? Okay, just checking. But like for me, it was always this thing that I was like, I think you become hyper observant when the things that are around you, the kind of culture of sexuality or whatever it is around you, isn't your immediate first choice. Like, I think you sort of become, as an outsider, you are observing things in a different way, in part because it doesn't feel particularly safe. And so, for example, you're guarding all the things that you do because you can't just come out and be in love with the person you're in love with around your friends. Like, you can't say, like, I think she's super hot because obviously that's not cool, but you learn the language of like how to appropriately say a boy is hot because you're sort of watching everybody. And I think that is actually, a really cool fringe benefit of being a little bit different.
And another thing I think is when you don't see yourself reflected in the people around you, I think that drives you towards books. I mean, I feel like that's why so many people who are different end up becoming writers, or at the very least, big readers. I mean, I read a lot when I was in high school because, yeah, I wanted to understand myself and who I was and the feelings that I was having, and I wasn't finding an explanation for that immediately around me. So I think that's kind of a cool thing about being different.
Jorjie?
Well, I was born in Thailand, and my family came here when I was 4, actually for just a vacation, but we are still here over 10 years later, so that changed. And I think I was pretty lucky as an Asian girl to grow up in the Bay Area because it's very, I would say, right now at least, it's very diverse. There are a lot of people like me. There aren't many Thai people, but, you know, with other Asians, I can relate to them, and I don't feel isolated or alone in my race.
Awesome. Yeah,
Thank you. All right, so still in your growing up time, but now related to books. Did you see characters with similar backgrounds to yourself in the books you read? And you can define background however you think. And if yes, what books? And if not, do you think that's changed over time?
So I'm 40. So when I was in high school, there wasn't a lot. I mean, there still aren't actually a lot of books, I think, about, there maybe aren't enough, let's say, about Asian or sort of like biracial Asian teens. But there was this one book called Obasan, which was this book about, by Joy Kagawa, which was about this girl and her experience of World War II in the internment of the Japanese. And people always wanted me to read it. People were always like, you're Japanese Canadian, you should read Obasan. And as a result, I never read it. I was like, I refuse. Like, you don't know me. And I think that there is this kind of obstinance. Like, I think that there can be.
When there's only one.
When there's one book, they're like, read this book. And I was like, that book has nothing to do with me. I was like, World War II. I mean, I don't care about that. Like, I was rude as a kid. But I think that there wasn't anything that I really saw. And I think I really, at the same time, really related to, like, I was obsessed with Harriet the Spy. I was obsessed with all of Beverly Clearly's books, and later on became, like, a huge reader of Canadian literature, like Margaret Atwood and Alice Munro and all those people. And I think that I related to that and the experience of being an outsider, not so much sort of connecting to like a racial or cultural experience. And I think today too, like there is something where I think that I think that for some people you can want a mirror, and I think for some people you also can't have a mirror foisted on you, right? Like it has to be this thing that you look for, and it can feel a little bit profile-y. Like there were many librarians, well-meaning librarians, throughout my career as a young reader in high school who, like I said, would bring up Joy Kagawa, and I was like, yeah, Joy Kagawa, thanks a lot, not interested. So, yeah, and I didn't really, I think the first thing that I found that I was really into was when I first saw Margaret Cho performing, that I was just like, I think because she was just so angry and Asian, I really appreciated that.
Kind of spinning off of that, just as you kind of felt like you didn't want to have to read this book that everyone was recommending to you, I think when you're growing up and you're starting to question your sexuality, you may not want to seek out these books, about LGBT teens, because if you were to read one of those books, it might mean that you are that, and so. I didn't seek out those books through most of my childhood and adolescence because I didn't want to admit that might be who I was. And I think maybe we can talk about this more a little bit later, but I think that's what makes it so important that we not only have diverse literature, but we also have make that diverse literature okay for everyone to read. I mean, you were talking about the window books and the mirror books. I feel like it's really important that we make it clear that books about different kinds of minorities are books that everyone can enjoy reading. So anyway, to get back to me, so yeah, I wasn't really reading any of those kinds of books when I was a younger person. But the thing that really clicked for me, or that I really connected to, was heroic stories about women. I was telling Mariko beforehand that I have this Wonder Woman obsession that I've had literally since I was 3 years old, and
Give you a Wonder Woman bookmark before you leave. 'Cause I've got
I
some.
love it. Thank you. Yeah, the Wonder Woman movie trailer just was released, and I've been like watching it over and over and over again. I used to love books with and movies and TV shows with heroic women. This was a little later when I was in my 20s, but I was obsessed with Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I feel like I was able to connect with those stories because they were about strong, complex, heroic characters who didn't conform to like a traditional masculine ideal. And for me, that was something that I could kind of connect to. So I feel like even if you're not necessarily literally connecting to, a literal mirror of you, you can find characters that reflect different aspects of you in satisfying ways.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it is kind of funny that you're just like, yeah, because the thing that I related to was before I was really conscious of like Japanese, like being Asian, I was like, I want to read about nerds. Like that was the thing that made sense to me. And those were the books that I was definitely drawn to, was anything like one of the first books that I really loved, like as a teenager, was Generation X by Douglas Copeland. Because I just thought about these kind of like hapless, weird nerds who were obsessed with pop culture the way I was obsessed with pop culture. So I was really into that. But I didn't really care if any of them were Asian or not. I just kind of wanted like that kind of culture. Because now nerd culture, I mean, you guys are so lucky that nerd culture is like about to be like the dominant culture and we're about to take over the world. But back in the day, like back in the 90s, like it wasn't super cool. Or back in the 80s, it wasn't cool to be a nerd. And the idea of like just like obsessing over, Dungeons and Dragons, like that was something you used to have to play in secret, like now you can have like magic cards at the library. Now it's all good. But so that was the thing that I was kind of going for. And I also, as a teenager, always wanted to make sure that I was reading something that my friends weren't reading, or so that it was like a little more complicated, or I would just like carry the books around. Like I would just carry around books about the occult because I was like, I just thought that wasn't what everybody else was doing. So I was down for that. Yeah, I got over my Wonder Woman phase early. I was more Wonder Woman when I was like 10, and then I like moved on.
Oh, ouch.
Yeah.
When I was a little kid, my mom literally made me like bracelets and a tiara out of paper, and I would run around with this string, and I would like tie up my grandma and make her tell me the truth. And I mean, I was very lucky that I had a really cool mom. I mean, we lived in Modesto, but she, I always knew was really cool. But yeah, I never got over the Wonder Woman thing though. And when I was in high school was when George Perez was doing his reboot of Wonder Woman, which was just really amazing. And I really like connected with that. I mean, I haven't really kept up with the Wonder Woman comic in recent years, but his rendition of Wonder Woman was just so, she was so kind and yet also so strong, and I love that. I love that. Yeah. Anyway,
Yeah.
do you have?
Yeah, I think my experience is pretty closely related to yours, because I think in elementary school I didn't even realize the lack of diversity in the books I was reading, and I didn't even have an issue about it because I just thought, it might also be because when I was that age, I feel like I thought white was kind of the default, so I was able to, relate to those characters and kind of erase the Asianness of myself from my mind. Yeah. But that wasn't even a big deal for me until maybe middle school age, when I realized none of these characters look like me or have a similar background, like as someone who moved to this country from another continent did.
Yeah, I think there's like residual things. Like I would read Sweet Valley High obsessively. Francine Pascal, represent. But I was obsessed with having like peachy skin and like flaxen blonde hair, which I never had. And so that I would always just like picture myself with like blonde hair. Or I would just like substitute those little things. But it wasn't like I was like, oh, I wish one of these characters was Asian. I was just like, wow, I guess it would be really great to have flaxen blonde hair. Like I just like made those like little decisions for myself. But then I also read Flowers in the Attic, and obviously then not so great to be a little blonde kid. So there's that.
Hopefully that one's not anyone's mirror.
Oh my gosh.
Although it might be. It's okay
Also,
if it
it's
is.
funny
okay if it
because,
is.
I mean, really, it's such a leap. Like, I mean, the books that were for kids were so different. Like, I had, I mean, I was fortunate to have Beverly Clearly, and I read the Little House on the Prairie series, was obviously obsessed with those. But yeah, like, when I was a kid, the books that, like, the Harry Potter of my day was Flowers in the Attic. That's what we were all reading, so.
There's this podcast called Overdue. Have you heard of it? They like take a book and they read it and then they talk about it. They spend an hour talking about it. And there was this recent episode of Overdue, it was guest host. It wasn't the regular host who did it, but they talked about Flowers in the Attic. It was so funny. They were just like. Yeah, well, I read it when I was in high school too, and I got really into it. It was twisted.
We probably have it out there if you guys want to check it out.
Oh, do they? Oh, God.
The Seeds of Yesterday is pretty good. The third one,
I don't think I got that far.
Flowers in the Attic, If There Be Thorns, The Seeds of Yesterday,
Is that the ballet one or the
Petals in the Wind. Because you just want to kill that metaphor. You just want to take that metaphor and just grind it into the earth. And I remember The Seeds of Yesterday was pretty good. I think that is the one where she becomes a ballerina. Maybe that's it.
Okay.
So I'm not recommending it. I'm just saying it's not as great as the other one.
Okay, so how did all of this affect your writing once you started? Or was it a conscious thing at all, or if it did, maybe it didn't?
Well, I think, the one thing I will say is that I started my writing career as part of a queer literary scene that sort of started up in Montreal when I was going to university and kind of expanded to Toronto. And so I was very lucky that the first things that I wrote were for a specifically queer audience, and they were about kind of storytelling and spoken word and all that stuff that was very personal and was this like very radical feminist place of just really just talking about what was happening. So, talking about things like sexual assault and sex and heartbreak and politics and all of those things was sort of where I came from as a writer. But when I moved on to the first book that I wrote, I was always conscious that I wanted the characters to be... It's weird because you don't want it to be you. I don't want to write a book about myself. But I was very conscious that I wanted the characters to be Asian. And Skim, when Jillian and I were talking about the character, it was really important to me that the characters be like a chubby Asian girl. That she looked like a regular teenager, like the teenagers that I remember, and not this kind of like, not Emily the Strange, where even though she's a cartoon, she's still skinny. Like, it was super important to me. And that's another thing, too, is that there's still not a lot of fat girls in literature, which is a crying shame because fat girls are awesome. So it was really important to me that it also be a book about a girl who's fat, where the story isn't about her being fat, because that's the other sort of flip side of representation becomes an issue book, which I'm not a big fan of. So I think that I always write from a place of wanting to represent with some accuracy the experiences that I had as a teenager and the experiences around me that I see teenagers having. And so I think it's been less of a focus on diversity than a focus on like accuracy. Like, I actually just wrote the first comic that I wrote. This is my first comic, the one that's about to come out. Setting it in the East Bay. And it took me a long time to write it because I really wanted to try as much as possible to connect to what it looks like to be a teenager in the East Bay. So, it's been a sort of non-literary but very literary goal of mine.
So I actually, I never really even had to think about it in terms of whether or not I wanted to write about gay characters. That just kind of was automatic. I mean, after I graduated from high school, I went to a very liberal college and very quickly became comfortable with myself as a gay person while I was there. But for me, it was actually I had to like come out as a YA writer because like I spent years writing and went to a graduate creative writing program that was very snooty, and it was all about literary fiction, and that was what you were supposed to write, and genre fiction of any kind was looked down upon. And for a while after I graduated from that, and the program was great, and I learned so much, and I had a wonderful experience there, but for a while afterwards, I felt like I was supposed to write literary fiction, and that's what I did. And nothing against literary fiction either. I love reading it, and but
There's some really good literary fiction out there.
yeah, I've heard a couple.
Some of it's all right.
A couple.
Yeah.
But then I was like, one day I was like, what would be really fun to write for kids? And I wrote my first novel, which hasn't been published, is actually a middle grade. And I wrote this middle grade fantasy book and had such a blast writing it. And I like never looked back. And I do, there is something about it that feels like I'm doing something important, writing the kind of book that I would have wanted to read when I was a kid, because it's changing now, but there just wasn't anything like that back then, and I think it's so important to fill that space. But also, I just have so much fun writing it. I mean, it's like, it definitely feeds me too to read to write just like the, adventure-packed, dramatic stories that I loved reading when I was younger.
Also, I think, if you're interested in identity, which, like I said, because I've never sort of taken it for granted, has always been something that's interesting, writing about high school is kind of awesome, because high school is the one place where you're like trying on your identity for the first time. So, like, high school is a place where you can be like, I'm going to be a jock. I'm going to do this jock thing. I'm going to wear these clothes, these ugly shorts that are really big, and I'm going to wear these huge shoes, and I'm going to do this. And then you can be like, I'm going to be a goth. I'm going to change my mind, and you can switch it up. Like I always tell high schoolers that high school is like drag. It's like your chance to try on an identity, and it's like a little hub for you doing that. And you get to see the boundaries of it. You get to see what people won't read you as, like what's not legible, and how that relates to gender. Like someone's like, a girl can't be like that, or an Asian person can't be like that. Like you get to kind of, it's really the sort of alchemy of it is all in university, or in a high school and university. And then you get to be an adult, and everybody just like, you just are the person you are. Like it stops being this like kind of amorphous thing. So I think it's actually really, I also was an accidental YA writer because I just wrote this book about a teenager with Jillian, and then it got bought by a YA publisher, which was funny because the original cover had the F word on it, which we took off. Once we got purchased by a YA publisher, so then, yeah, like that's when somebody told me, they were like, well, if you write about teenagers, it's for teenagers. I was like, that's news to me. So yeah, and I also just think high school is more interesting. Everything about it, everything about the experience of it.
It's so heightened.
Yeah, it's so heightened. Like it just sort of seems like, yeah, everything is more intense. Everything is sadder or happier or goofier or weirder. Although it's funny because also I think the flip side of that is that I think people are less mature for longer. So like I'm 40. So that's all I have to say about that. So I think that the actual phase of being an adolescent has kind of expanded beyond high school now. So that's why you have so many adult readers of YA, which I'm also down with, because to me it also means that we've kind of slipped the bounds of sort of feeling that you have to like be grown up or become a grown up or become this thing, and then you're a grown up and you have this job and everything is just set. Like, you can just be whatever you want to be. Like you can go to Burning Man and put on a tail and whatever you want to do.
So for Jorjie, does now that you're thinking about diversity, does it affect the books you choose to read or how you read them?
Oh, now definitely, I think. Since, for a few years, I definitely look for diversity in books, and when there isn't diversity, I notice it, and I am not content with it. So, yeah.
So any writers in the room, remember that. 'Cause Jorjie's not gonna like it. Okay, so how much research do you do when writing a character of a different background than yourself? It could be race or religion, anything in that area.
I do a lot of research. I'm writing the Lara Croft Tomb Raider series now, which involves a ton of research because you want to be accurate about something like someone's culture, in as much as you can be when you're writing a series that's also about the search for immortality and stuff like that. But I think that one thing I said, I was at a panel like this recently, and this woman who's in her 80s was asking me about LGBT people, and she was asking a lot of vaguely invasive questions. And it turned out that she was working on a book, and she wanted to put a lesbian character in there, and the book takes place in 2060. It's about this 2060 and what 2060 will be like. And there's a lesbian in it, so that's good. That will still be around in 2060. Yeah, but she said, well, I showed it to my lesbian friend, and my lesbian friend thinks it's okay, so what do you think? And I said to her, the thing about diversity is you can't just keep getting okays and thumbs up from the various people of different races and religious and cultural backgrounds and sexualities and stuff like that. But what you can be is responsible for the characters that you create, and you are responsible for them. And part of being responsible is that it's entirely possible that someone's going to come up to you and say, this isn't accurate to my experience. And you have to be able to respond to that. You can do all the research you want, and you can try to make characters realistic and try to make them... I think when you're trying to make a character a human, so it's not about I got to write this Chinese character, so I got to go find out about the Chinese, so much as I got to write this Chinese character who's a person, so they should act like a person in this book is, to me, one of the more important things too. But yeah, you're responsible. And I've definitely heard feedback, even as of recently, about books and people asking me about, different characters. And I think that that's part of the dialogue. I take everything that people tell me to heart and still try to make the characters, make sense to me.
Yeah, I think I try not to think of, this is my X character, and so I need to do research on X culture to write this character. I try to think of each of my characters as an individual, and a specific particular person, and when I'm writing that character, there'll inevitably be research that I have to do to make that character breathe. And part of that research will probably be cultural, but part of it will have to do with, how can I make whatever they do for a living convincing, or my portrayal of where they live convincing. So, I don't like to think of my my characters as ticking off boxes. I want to think of them as people, but within that, definitely that there will be research that has to be done.
Well, I think you also have to think of context. I think that if you're writing about a person in modern America, you can't write about living in modern America without writing about racism and the experience of living in a world where, racism exists in the specific way it exists today, which is to say that, if you were writing about it in the 1940s, it would be one experience. If you were writing about it in the 60s, it would be another. And if you're writing about it today, it would be something else. If you read Sweet Valley High, there's maybe one book where it's this is the racism book, and where the Wakefield twins experience racism from somebody else, not of themselves. But I think that that's the thing. You can't. I don't want to write people in a bubble. So also you have to write about the experience of what it's like to have money or not have money. To have parents who have jobs or who don't have jobs, or are. It's the same way that it's you can write the two parents who are the Charlie Brown, the wah-wah who just kind of appear, or you can write about what it's like to live in a family with two other humans who have their own problems. It's all the sort of the house that your characters live in has to be a realistic house.
Well, for all of you guys, for authors who don't want to write diverse characters because they're worried they're going to screw it up and make people be mad at them. What would you say to those?
As a reader, I would say that I think when there's diversity in books, it's always appreciated. When it's written really badly by someone who is not diverse in the same way as their character is, then it's not great. I came up with this question actually because I wanted to know what people thought. Because when there's a white author who writes about a person of color, and a lot of the focus is on their race and their, identity and the race as their part of their identity, I feel like if that's messed up or if that's not done well, then it's not very good. But I feel like if I was just speaking to an author who wanted to, then I would say yeah, because at least you tried.
So, my mother, who is a wonderful white woman from Southern Ontario, gave me Tales from a Geisha. Is that what the book is called? It's the history of Memoirs of a Geisha. And I was like, oh, awesome, Memoirs of a Geisha. Thank you, Mom. But when I was flipping through it, I was like, oh, it's written by some white guy in the South. And I was like, I'm not reading this book. What the frick? Like, some guy is going to write the story of this, unique population of women. Like, this guy is going to write this book. And then, of course, then they made it into a movie. It's because that's what happens in this world. But I was really angry and frustrated because I felt like the story hasn't been told, and it seems really unfair to me that this is the person who's going to tell this story. And it's definitely something that has stuck with me. Like, I think I was like 20 when I got the book. And it's definitely something I think about. And as a member of like a feminist literary community, the idea of representation and co-opting someone else's story is definitely something I think about a lot. So that said, I don't like this idea of this narrative of unless you've experienced it, you can't write it. Like, I think that really does put, it really does put a fence around what we understand the writing of fiction to be, and around the human imagination and all of those things. So I recognize myself as writing in a political context where there are definitely some writers who really, there's been maybe a dearth of certain populations of writers who've had a chance to publish their stories and get certain stories out there. So I try to think of that when I'm writing. So I personally have made the decision to write from my own experience, but at the same time, I want the experience to include a diversity of perspectives. So I, like Friends, like I don't want to write Friends. Does everybody know what I mean? The television show Friends, which is like the least New York series in the world because it's just like 5 white friends in this coffee shop, not even working, just hanging out in this coffee shop all day. So I tried to populate my books with like a diversity of experiences and with a diversity of characters in terms of their financial worlds and racial and cultural worlds. But I tend to stick to the experience of a character that is closer to my own experience. Which is not to say that I'm always going to do that. It's just that in this current context, especially in this current context in America and in Canada, I feel like that's a decision that I made as a young feminist. But I fight with my young feminist about it all the time. I'm like, do we still feel like this? My young feminist is like, we still feel like this. So I'm sticking with it for now.
I feel the exact same way. I have the exact same kind of... No, I haven't. I have the exact same kind of voices in my head. On the one hand, I feel like our job as writers is to put ourselves in the shoes of other people and practice empathy, and then practice the ability to convincingly portray the experiences, portray experiences outside of our own experiences. But on the other hand, I also, it does make a difference to, like, when I go see a movie about a gay character that stars an actor that I know is not gay. It shouldn't make a difference to me, and yet it does, and the same with books, so. Yeah, I've written, like, all the books that I've written so far have been written from a gay male point of view, but at the same time, I think that I'll probably branch out and try writing from other points of view, and when I do, it's going to be a greater challenge, and I will make a commitment to do it with care, because I know that there are implications to writing from a viewpoint that's significantly removed from your own, and that it's important to do it with respect and with care and with research and with work. That, I think that question that you asked is a really, really good one, and I think you're right that it's important for writers to make, especially in the world that we live in now, to make a commitment to representing the world as the diverse place that it is, and yet at the same time to recognize that to do that well requires work and it requires research, and it's just really important to do that.
Right, and I mean, I want to see more books out there by more diverse authors. Like, I really think that it's like an understanding of equity, right? Like, it's not that we're on a level playing field where there's been the same amount of stories by the same number of people representing the same number of experiences this whole time. So I think that the thing that upset me about Memoirs of the Geisha was that I was like, there aren't a lot of Japanese Canadian women writers or Japanese women writers who are getting these stories out there. So it feels like, given the existing playing field, we have to take certain considerations. But that's not to say, the same time, I was at a conference once where somebody was like, you're not allowed to write these stories. Like, you cannot write a story of, a Muslim woman, for example, if you are not Muslim. And the truth is, you can do whatever you want as an author. You can make a choice, and publishers make choices and authors make choices, but you're also, to me, I feel the weight of those choices. So I wouldn't make that choice because of the way I see the current sort of publishing stratosphere, but it's not to say that those choices aren't out there to be made. It is a choice to decide what perspective you write from.
Okay, this is a perfect segue, and this next question will come back later when we're brainstorming. So how has being a diverse person and also writing diverse characters, how has that affected your publishing journey?
You go.
Okay.
Be as honest as you feel comfortable being honest.
So my imprint, I've been published by Simon & Schuster, and they have an imprint, Simon Pulse, which is geared towards young adult readers, and it does a really great job of being very representative and being very willing to publish books from authors of different minorities, and also of I would talk to my editor about things that I was thinking about including in my books and stuff, and saying, I don't know if this is gonna make it sell, and he's like, don't worry about that, and so in that way it's been really positive, but there is a reality, which is that I know that books with gay main characters don't sell as well, and just on the whole, as a general rule, I think that's starting to change, but there definitely are economic realities. I don't know if I would be making more money if I'd made the choice to write about straight characters, and there are lots of LGBT authors who make that choice to write more mainstream books, and the chances are good that if I were to make that choice, I would be making more money. But it's just not a choice I want to make. It's not the stories I want to tell, and the truth is that, as I'm sure you would agree, if you're a writer in the first place, you're not someone who's expecting to be making a good living, And so it's like in for a penny, in for a pound, I might as well just like tell exactly the story I want to tell, as long as I'm not going to be making that much money doing it.
There you go. That's the reality. My first publishers were all sort of women's publishers. So my very first book was published by McGilligan Books, which was basically this woman's house. And she was a college creative writing teacher, and so she published my first books. And then my next publisher was Women's Press, which is sort of self-explanatory. And so for the longest time, I sort of only expected myself to be writing books for a certain population of like feminists, and I imagined like there would be like a cup of chamomile tea in my book, and that would be a night for a lot of women, or like a small population of maybe like 1,000 women in Canada. And so I was really surprised, actually. And it's funny. So the first graphic novel that Jillian and I published, Skim, which is this book about this teenage girl. This is back in 2008, and we did the comic book circuit. And so you sit at a table for comic books. You sit at a table with your book, and people walk by and flip through it and decide if they want to buy it. And it was, kind of less diverse group of people back then. And so all these men would come by our table and like thumb through the book, and then they would say, "What's this book about?" And we had this, finally you had this very short answer. You'd be like, "A girl in high school," and they'd be like, "Nope," and they would just walk by. And I sort of thought, like, okay, well, that's how this is going to go. Obviously, we just have to wait for the women with their tea to come by and buy this book. But eventually, it really was embraced by the comic book community, and the comic book community, which is just rapidly changing in such a fantastic way. And then our last comic book, which is still a story about two girls at the cottage. People don't ask that question anymore. I feel like the question of like, what's this book about, i.e. like, is this a story about me that I'm going to read it, has kind of disappeared from my experience of the comic book world. And so that's been really amazing and really surprising too. I'm not saying that the question still doesn't exist, and I think there's still this notion of like books for girls and books for boys and comics for girls and comics for boys, but I feel like that as the kind of like standard entry point for comic book readers is definitely shifting, which I think is great. So yeah, I think I feel like the things that I want to write are less and less kind of described as being any kind of niche. And actually, it's funny to me because I'm rarely described as like an LGBTQ writer. Like I feel like I rarely sit at that table, but I am. So it's kind of odd to me that it's sort of not been doesn't come up more. I feel like I get more often described as like a YA writer or a comic book writer, which to me is really interesting. I think it doesn't necessarily say, it's not necessarily an accurate statement because there's a ton of queerness in everything I do. But it's interesting that it's not the first thing that comes up, which I find really interesting.
I've actually found the same thing. In my book that's coming out this October, I was working on the jacket copy with my editor, like the blurb that goes up on Amazon and stuff, and I was like, oh, this doesn't mention that the main character is gay. Shouldn't potential readers know that so they know what they're getting into? And he was like, oh, okay, I guess. And it was great. I thought that I was the one that had to bring that up, and he didn't seem that concerned about it. So yeah, I definitely think things are changing in that way.
Yeah. It's changing and then it doesn't change, right? Like you have like pockets of change and then you have pockets of like, seems like everything is still the same. Like, you get sort of comments about your book that sort of are criticisms that seem to be like a complaint that it's so much about girls or so much about gayness. Yeah. When there's rarely a complaint that's like, this book is really about straight guys. This book is, a lot about straight guys. Like no one says that Lord of the Flies is a book about straight boys. It's about so many other things. So I think that it is still this kind of back and forth. Look what's happened with Ghostbusters, right? Like on the one hand, everybody's like, this is an awesome movie. And then the other hand, it's like, this is a movie about all women. And that's, a cause for concern for some people. Not me, obviously.
It's ruining their childhood. Oh, that's so sad. Good. I'm going to ask one more question before I go to the crowd for questions, and then we'll all brainstorm together. So there's, just kind of the books we librarians buy or readers buy, but there's also the issue of school and what, kids are made to read in school. So if there are any books you can kind of add to the canon of things we're made to read, or even if there are some you think we should toss out, there are suggestions.
Oh, I think that there should be a new book in every year. I read the canon when I was a kid, right? I read one work of Shakespeare, A Separate Piece, Lord of the Flies. And I remember actually that I went to an all-girls private school, and in grade 10, I had this conversation with my English teacher where I was like, why are we reading only books written by men? We're in an all-girls school. What's going on with that? So I think the idea of reading a new book by a new author, and maybe reading a comic book every once in a while, wouldn't kill anybody. I think that would be pretty cool. Mm-hmm. I think Ms. Marvel by G. Willow Wilson is probably one of my favorite superhero books going right now in the Lumberjanes, all those books, I think that are, showing sort of new perspectives and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. I think the idea that you have to read a certain canon of books so that you can understand all the books that will come after it is true, and also kind of like a shortcut for not really getting into the new books that are coming out. Mm-hmm.
I think that's actually a great idea to read a new book because, I always hear that argument that you don't really know if a book is going to stand the test of time until it's been around for 50 years or something. And so, you never read anything in class that's less than 50 years old. But first of all, I don't think that's completely true. With exceptions, when a book is good when you read it. And then also, so what if it's not, if it's a book that doesn't end up standing the test of time. I think reading something that speaks to this particular moment that you're living in is in and of itself really valuable. And I think having a more recent books would be a great idea. I can't think of any specific. What's that?
I was saying about Jorjie.
Oh, Jorjie, yeah.
Well, I'm still in high school, and I'm just entering my sophomore year, so I don't fully know what we're going to read. But I think... Yeah. But something that I don't think about a lot is that some people who aren't readers only read books that high schools make them read. So just thinking about that, I feel like the list needs to be updated. But just for me, as someone who doesn't read a lot of classics, mostly reads books coming out, this year or last year, I like that we read the old books about just, straight white guys, because I guess I don't read a lot of those. But also, on the other hand, there are people who don't read about more diverse characters and are only getting that perspective. So I can't really answer the question, I don't think.
You could at least throw half of the straight dead white guys out.
Well, but here's the thing, I think also a book like Lord of the Flies is very much a book of its time, and it's a reflection of the reality of what, when that book was written. Also, it's strangely erotic if you read it as an adult. But I think if you could supplement something like that with, I think if you read something like 365 Days by David Levithan, which is very much a book about the experience of being a teenager today. It's a book about this kid who wakes up every day in a different body. But I think if you contrasted that with what it's like to wake up on an island with a bunch of your schoolmates, I think that would be a really interesting commentary on the time that we live in now in comparison to the time that they lived in. I think if you set a book up as a metaphor for the experience of adolescent, sort of whole hog, it's really not an accurate metaphor. But if we can be more specific about it and contrast it with something else and something newer, even something like Divergent, maybe that's not like your first pick, but still, I think that it is about, it does reflect something of like sort of like a modern experience of oppression, right? Like, and that's what also Lord of the Flies is about. So I think that there's a lot of arguments for bringing in new books, even if you don't, like you said, even if you don't think that they're like, they don't have the literary merit that's going to make them, stand the test of time. You read books, as like you said, as windows and mirrors. So I think that kind of approach to reading is something that really, I think, resonates with a lot of younger readers.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we got questions from the audience. Anything you want to ask these guys? Or if you want to answer any of the questions that have been happening. Ashley?
Anything.
I was thinking back to what I read, and one of the books that really struck me was, I can't remember the title of it, but it was about Melba Beals, who was one of the Little Rock Nine, who integrated a high school in Arkansas. And so thinking about like, okay, so that was really relevant to her high school experience back in the 60s. So like, is it important to read her book or even Anne Frank? Like, is it important to read those books, or is it more important to read like the modern version of that? Like what's more relevant for young adults, or can you not choose between those two?
And I think it's important to read both. Yeah. Like, I think what a great like assignment it would be to read both of those books, like the experience of, of war, what war looks like, how we wrote about war in like the 1950s or 60s, and how we write about the experience of war now, I think is really, because I think the idea of reading the classics, really, like I said, it just feels like, I'm glad I read Shakespeare. In my own way, I'm really glad that I read Shakespeare. But I think that, as like an experience of writing about love and what love means, there's things that were true in Shakespeare that are still true today, but there's also some new thoughts about love that have come up in the last, say, 100 years, that would be interesting to compare and contrast.
I agree. I don't know that I have anything to add to that. Yeah.
What about you, Jorjie?
No, she said it.
Any other questions from you guys? If not, we'll start to plot. Can I have my handwriter? Okay, so someone's going to come in.
Who's going to come and write? Who has really good penmanship?
One of you guys, come on. Okay, they're going to write. 2 out of 3, come on. Okay, so this is all full-on audience participation. All you guys got to help us out. So in the room, we've got readers and writers and librarians. So kind of as all those identities. Speaking of identity, what we can all do. And we also have school librarians. And I don't know if we have any teachers in here, maybe? No? So maybe first brainstorm what our challenges are in getting more diverse books widely read, even published for teens. Yeah, I can write challenges. So we've mentioned some of them, like curriculum.
Availability.
Jillian?
People banning them.
Yeah.
Because of option.
Yeah, diverse books are the #1 banned books every year. ALA has they do studies every year, and they're usually the top books are, like Sherman Alexi's a big one, so that's a Native American character.
Raina's book, drama.
Yeah, gay characters are frequently banned. But they're in danger from that as well. Another writers having to make a living, so they might choose to not write diverse books because they want to make more money.
Yeah.
Well, I think also there's this notion of what seems like financially viable for publishers to publish. Like there's the notion that publishers want to make a profit, and so they want to publish books that they think will connect to the largest audience possible. Sorry, that's really long. Money.
Another thing is what we were talking a little bit about before, about just changing the perception in the general population that a book with a Japanese Canadian protagonist is for Japanese Canadian readers, and instead trying to just open up.
Narrow understanding of readership.
Well, like I'm writing a gay. That is one thing that I've gotten a little bit. Like with my book is I've gotten the sense that some people assume that because it's a gay protagonist that it's specifically a book for gay teenagers, and I'm like, no, I wrote this for anybody to read, not just teenagers, adults too, hopefully, and certainly not just gay people, and I feel like I want. Yeah, I want to feel like a book about any kind of character could potentially be a mainstream.
So like mistakenly thinking that X books are for X readers. Like gay books are for gay readers.
Right.
Books about African Americans are for African American readers.
Yeah.
That whole mistake.
Yeah, I know I did have a really great and well-meaning teacher in high school who, at a certain period, gave my friend Harold Giovanni's room, and, maybe gave me, like, Nella Larson's Passing, because, like, it is kind of, yeah, like, you're gay and black and you're biracial, here are your books. But then also, and they're, both great books. There's also a lot of the older books are terribly, terribly depressing. It's sort of like
no
your life is
kidding.
going to be isolated and terrible and
Yeah.
lonely, which probably modern day teens might not want to hear so
Yeah.
much. So it may or may not help them. But, if you get that, with, you can give someone Giovanni's Room, but also give them Aristotle and Dante maybe. And, like, you could have a really great romance and a good time also.
Like maybe you don't want to read Well of Loneliness if you're a young lesbian nowadays. Like even the title Well of Loneliness, you're like, oh God. I just want to watch Degrassi High. I don't want to read this.
Yeah, and also kind of, Tim, what you're saying too is the feeling that it marks you as a reader.
Stereotyping readers.
Because I know, we as librarians, we often like to do diverse displays, in the teen area, whatever. But also, yeah, if you feel like if you pick up a book from that, rainbow display, you're marking yourself for everybody who's in the library as,
Oh yeah, totally.
Well, what I'd really love is for a straight girl to go up to a librarian and say, "Oh, do you have any great books that you'd like to recommend?" And the librarian suggests a book with a gay male protagonist, and say, "This is just a great book." And just being able to.
Yes, maybe like how we pitch books.
Yeah, I mean, I spent my whole life reading books about straight people, and I got really into them, and I loved them, and I could totally emotionally connect with them. So I suspect that straight readers can connect with characters with gay characters too. What's that?
Book covers are a challenge. I had a young man that really liked romance, but he had to very carefully pick the covers because he got a lot of grief when he was reading something that was romantic.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, and that's also something that. Yeah, I mean, publishers also make very specific choices about book covers because of who they think is going to read the book, which I think sometimes, you're like, I don't necessarily want a purple book just because I'm a funny woman, like. I think it is, but it is tricky because it's like, the marketing game, there's so much at stake with who you want to make sure you get your books to. Like, you want to make sure you get your books to the right readers at the very least and at the beginning. So it's a really hard
So another
process.
challenge is how other books sell. So if you write a book, happens to have a Chinese American girl in it, and it doesn't sell, they'll be like, oh, no more of those this year. That didn't do very well. But if it does, great, then it's like, oh, that one was special. We don't need more of those. So there's kind of tricky that way.
Well, I think it's also
Or there's like a lot riding on you as a writer.
right, like wanting to support. Yeah, I don't know. Sorry, I have just my Hershey's Kisses just ran out, so I. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
I was a middle school teacher librarian this last year, and one of the situations, well, two. One is the mirroring. I worked at a school that was predominantly Asian, and a lot of students came to me and wanted books about Filipino kids, and we had nothing, and it was really hard to find. And then the other thing was we ran into a lot of a familiar middle school refrain is that's so racist, and a lot of it had to do with like titles of books. Like we had a book called Yellow Girl, you know, and people like picked it up. This is so racist. Who could call this book this?
Right.
Or like we had a book called Two Boys Kissing, and the boys would bring it up and they'd be like, how can you have a book like this in the library? It's so... I'm like, well, we got something of everything, you know, just chill.
Yeah. I think chill is a really good response to a lot of... I think if everybody would just chill, a lot of library issues would cease to exist. Just chill. It's okay. I mean, it's funny because it's like... I think it really is tricky, like when you have an audience that really wants specific mirroring and those books don't exist. Like you could say to someone who's Filipino, like, well, this is a book called American Born Chinese, and it's about being an Asian kid in a school. But if you're Filipino, you may want a book about that, and that's, you know, it may feel like a second prize to get this book that doesn't really reflect your experiences.
Yeah.
I'm a teacher librarian in middle school as well, and I think that one of the things, like we kind of get skipped over, I think schools are marginalized in our society, teachers are somewhat marginalized, and we have access to a lot of kids who are marginalized and a lot of diverse kids, but we need people to be reaching out to us also, and we need to be really aware of what's going on, and we're limited very, very badly by money. Even in ways that public libraries might not be.
That's definitely true.
And yet, like, kids go to school every day. They have to go to school, right? They don't have to go to the public library. But I have access to kids every single day. And so, like, books have to get to the school librarians, and we need school librarians. It's the other problem, because there's so many schools without librarians, and that's where there are kids there who need mirrors. So some of it, I mean, this is, you know, it's advocacy around education and valuing teacher librarians and recognizing the potential there as well. Because not only do these books need to get published, but they need to get to the kids who need them the most.
Well, and I mean, to me, that's always been the most interesting thing. Like, I never, as an author, made so many connections to schools and libraries until I was a YA author. Like the majority of promotion of a book that's for young adults involves working with schools and librarians, which to me is amazing. Like, I think that that's actually one of the things that makes me want to continue writing books for this audience. And I have always said to my publisher, like, I'm here. I live and work in California. I don't have any kids or cats even. I have tons of time. So I think that it's also about making connections with publishers because I think that there are a lot of people who are writing books who want to connect to the people who are reading them. And I think that it's, if it's between going to like a bookstore and sitting for an hour and talking to maybe like, a dozen people versus getting a chance to go to a classroom, I think most of us would rather go to a classroom and really connect with students. So I think it's also about making that connection between publishers and the sort of different, libraries and different schools that are out there, and making more of a connection between those two things.
Yeah, I think, you're talking about how public schools are so, limited financially. And I think it's unfortunate that right now publishers are kind of going through a really hard time financially too. And my impression is that the marketing and the library, specifically like the library marketing department at a lot of publishers, is a little more limited now. Do you get that same impression?
I feel like I don't know, I spent a lot of time in the library, so I didn't really, from my personal experience, get that impression, but I think in general, the idea of like marketing has, really changed, like I think marketing has really generally fallen on the side of the author. Like, that's why every author, for better or for worse, is to have a Twitter account so that we're accessible. And I think it is an overwhelming thing for most publishers to manage the ins and outs of everything that their authors do in terms of promoting their books. But I mean, I also, when I was in Canada, there were so many programs to get authors into schools, and I really that's always been a huge thing for me. I mean, part of it is also that, obviously I like kids, and that's why I write about them. So, being around them more is always, a plus for me. So, I mean, I wish there were more programs out there that brought authors into schools and into libraries because, yeah, I mean, that's your core audience. Why wouldn't we want kids to be reading more books? Obviously, we do.
Yeah.
So I guess maybe what I'm saying is that we need to keep working on building connections directly between, like you're saying, it seems like the whole marketing and public outreach is falling more on the writer than on the publisher now than it has been in the past, and maybe we need to work more on building direct connections between authors and schools or something.
Yeah, I mean, if there were more, are there programs that bring authors into schools in California?
I think the challenge with that is, again, funding. I know our middle school librarian doesn't have a budget. She has to raise her entire budget for books and for that. So, yeah. She hustles. She's great. But she has to hustle for the money to do those kinds of programs. Yeah. Yeah, in your schools.
Yeah, I mean, I work in a public elementary school in Palo Alto, and they have probably 4 or 5 author visits a year. And then, she'll promote, the librarian will promote the book, and then they have a book sale, I think, twice a year, so the kids come and buy it and stuff. But that's elementary, and that's one of the best funded school districts in the country. So that's definitely the end of the spectrum.
So with our kind of limited resources as readers and writers and librarians, what can we do to kind of spread diverse books? Any teens got any ideas? Well, maybe number 1, we can read them. Oh, yeah. So challenges, solutions, I don't know. That's kind of boring, but.
Ideas.
Ideas is better. Oh. But I'd say start with making an effort to read diverse things. It's kind of maybe step 1.
As librarians, we should be then book talking about in schools and to our teens.
Yeah, I mean, I think the displays are always really interesting. Whenever I go into a library, I always check and see what 8 books have been pulled out and put on the table when you walk in. I always check them out and see what you guys are selecting. And I think it's, I think that there's these sort of main titles like American history or LGBTQ, but I think also it could be love stories, or it could be there are broader categories that you could pull out books and then have a more, interesting selection. I think if you had a collection of books that was young people in love or love hurts or whatever, then instead of having to have these are all the gay books, it could be here's all the books that are about love, which technically anybody could read.
I did one out of time, which I both did science fiction and historical fiction.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah.
And I also work for the San Francisco Public Library. With our children's, we have a children's book club at West Portal, and one of the things I noticed they did was the main children's librarian uses the authors' podcasts about their books to present a selection of books, and then she had the kids on the council vote after each podcast, would you read this book? Why would you want to read it? And then kind of kept track of that information and then used that in promoting the books and doing displays. So.
We have a couple of people in here who are collectors for libraries. They do the buying. So what would we tell those guys?
Maybe one idea just to throw it out is a lot of our marketing is sort of static. So we go to the advertisement. It comes up on the TV. It's on the billboard in the magazine, but we actually have to go to it. But if there's a way that you could actually push new books to readers better, so you get an alert on your phone rather than like an email, but something that was like way more direct might be one way to increase that, because then you actually, I think a lot of it's just about how well people see. They don't even know that it's there lots of times.
Yeah.
So.
I know another challenge for you guys is vendors, and sometimes, the diverse books might be smaller publishers, and that can be harder for libraries to get. So I don't know what the solution to that is, but it's a challenge.
Well, I think too, it's like I think the way we sort of, because I mean, I'm really like, there's always like the top 100 books list that various publications put out, and it's so subjective as to what makes something the best. And I think if the lists were more skewed towards like new books and new perspectives, 10 new books and new perspectives. So the idea, instead of having to do a roundup of all the books that you really loved, because we love lots of books, right? And even the books that you're like, well, this is a book by a new author and they're representing a new perspective. Maybe it's not the top one, like the top 10 book, but it's an important book to read because we need to know more about these books. I think the other thing to consider too is that, when you have new perspectives and sort of new communities that are being represented in the literary world, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get the same kind of literature you're expecting. You're not necessarily going to get what looks to you like a best-selling, top YA book, but it doesn't mean that they're not important. Like when queer publishing first started, a lot of the sort of first queer books, some of them are rougher around the edges and some of them are not necessarily like the narratives we're expecting. But to kind of go out and highlight those books in your lists for other librarians, I think is really important to sort of like decide what we're going to really look for and talk about and share with people when we do sort of our blog posts. Like I get really annoyed when I see the December rolls around and someone does a roundup of like the most important books of the year. I'm like, based on what? What's an important book? Like, is it important because we've all been waiting for this like trilogy to conclude and now we're all really excited? Or is it important because we've never seen a book like this? We haven't had a lot of books about what it's like to be a newcomer, an immigrant to a country. Like, I think if you had a list that was like, let's pick something that is about diversity and highlight 10 books about that came out this year, would be a really interesting resource for people.
Yeah, question for all the teens. How do you find the books you read? Yeah.
Well, from the library, like the what's it called?
Like
The
this,
shelf thing in the middle.
the displays? Yeah. Yeah, Jillian?
Friends and parents recommending them.
Anyone else? Yeah, Sarah?
For me, it's also stuff in the media. So if something was based off of a book, then I'll read it, or a movie that is based off a book, then I'll read it.
Does anybody read book blogs?
Yeah, for teens, do you find any of your book stuff social media wise? Do you follow any authors or no? That's good to know.
Kind of help out sometimes.
I know that if there's like an author that I like and they have a series or something, I'll check their websites to see when their new books are coming out. If I'm interested.
And on Goodreads, there's actually a function where, like, I have a Goodreads account, and sometimes, monthly, they'll send you an email with books from authors you've read before, or like really cool YA books coming out this month, and sometimes I check those out.
Do you think those, like the books you might like lists, are diverse? I don't know. Do you think they think about that, or they?
In the emails? Or
Yeah, because
in general?
one thing we could do maybe is like, contact Goodreads, all of us, and tell them that they should think about that when promoting books every month.
Sometimes I just kind of look through the list. They're usually pretty well-known books, like from well-known authors. So I can't think of any off the top of my
Yeah.
head.
Well, it does seem kind of in a roundabout way that adults are responsible for a lot of the books that teens end up reading, because of the things we buy or display, or, so that's something for all of us to think about, that when we do put things out, it's kind of leading people. Yeah, Trevor?
This is sort of like grassrooty, but I remember reading a lot of zines. I still read some zines, and I moonlight as a micro publisher. So chapter of their book, pick it up, because all those little things actually help the publishers know that that's a book that they should continue making more of. So there's a lot of things that we can just do with our wallets and with our attention, just by being present somewhere, that end up giving a very clear signal. And with that, also, you could think about doing your own sort of micro-publishing. If you have friends that are writing, and you think, oh, you're a great writer, offer to copy it for them, and sew it up into a little book, and then distribute that to your friends. Because even though that's a very small thing, it's still reading it so that it's a community that can then make bigger and bigger things as it goes through time.
Also, I mean, supporting smaller publishers, because that's who publishes new authors. Most of the time, if you have a new young author, they're going to not be, it's not necessarily, I mean, sometimes it is Simon & Schuster, but a lot of people's first novels come out from much smaller presses. And I can't remember what's the name of the San Francisco one that Michelle T. used to run.
Chronicle?
No, not
No.
Chronicle. Ugh.
One press?
Pardon?
One press?
It's based out of the store. It's like that store in San Francisco.
Like,
The Valencia one.
oh, yeah, A26 Valencia. A26.
No, A26 Valencia is, although A26 Valencia is a super great organization to support. But I think, especially if you live in a certain place, you should, pardon? No, it's not McSweeney's either. It's going to kill me. I'm 40, so I've lost all my nouns, so I don't know anything. But I think that if you live in a city, and especially if you live in a city, Oakland or the East Bay or San Francisco, you should find out who the small publishers are where you are and find out what they're putting out. I mean, the press that I'm thinking of put out the Rad American Woman series by Kate Skelsa, or Kate Schatz. And so, that's like a local author who's highlighting diversity because, that's the other thing is that a lot of smaller presses are political and are making choices about their books that they publish, not necessarily about sales, but about supporting local authors. So that's a really important thing to consider.
And also, too, for libraries, we look at our circulation also. So, check those books out, take them home. And also, independent bookstores, you can probably go in and, talk to whoever's working there about what you want to see, and that might actually have an impact, also, the kind of books you want.
I have an idea. If everyone could actually, everyone has some sort of social media account. Anytime you read a really great, diverse book, just, post about it. Give a little, one sentence book review, and all of your friends will see it, or all of your teams.
Yeah, put it on your Goodreads.
Yeah, that's a really good idea.
Yeah, Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr.
Along with that too, I mean, Alameda County Library has right on the front page suggest a book. So if there's a book that you want, and you're like, oh, that's a great book, and you look through the collection, and you think, oh, they don't have it, just suggest it. One of us will buy it.
Yeah, those two guys back there are the buyers, so.
City Lights, thank you. City Lights. So they're an amazing publisher, and they definitely have, a lot of smaller publishers, have a manifesto, right? And are publishing because they want to publish, and they choose, I know that the new editor who took over from Michelle T. has been making really interesting choices and really pulling out a lot of really great authors, and they do events all the time. And one of the ways that you can show them that you support them is by going to their events. The food is, but the readings are always interesting.
There's good food nearby.
Yeah, bring your own food.
Anybody have any other suggestions of things we can do? Yes.
For the authors to maybe take back to publishers, book trailers work really well, especially with young boys who I otherwise have a really hard time selling books to. But I did this thing this year, and I had books that I was just about ready to take out of my collection because they haven't been checked out in 5 years, and they've never been checked out. And these kids watched, boys especially, a 30-second commercial for it, and then I have waiting lists for all of them. So if you want to take back to publishers to invest a little bit in that, they really work for boys.
Something I'm going to personally do now after what he just mentioned, because I do all of the book buying for teens in my library, and I'll have our webmaster put a suggest a book on the teen page, and it can directly like email me.
Cool.
And then anytime a teen tells me, "Hey, we need this book," I like 99.9% of the time I buy it, unless
Sure.
it's a textbook that costs $400. But yeah, so yeah.
That reminds me, something my teen volunteers have done is we created little searching hashtag terms for our catalog. So we have hashtag BLM teens, which is Black Lives Matter teens. We have LGBT teens. And then we also have, what did you guys call it? Cheesy romance teens, which I think you do have diverse picks in there too, or choices in there. But then people can track those tags to find, like, oh, those are a bunch of, Black Lives Matter type books. You can find them all in the catalog.
And you can really see, like, I think just the way that comics have really taken over and, like, really taken off. Not taken over, sorry, that's Freudian slip. In libraries has been because there's been this, you can really see that there can be a change in the way, like, books appear in spaces over time. And I think when I first started with comics in 2008, there was like a small, like the librarian would take you to the small section of like manga. They'd be like, this is our comics section. And you'd be like, that's really tiny. And now it's such a significant presence and the presence of librarians at comic book things has totally changed too. And I feel like it is possible to change the kinds of books that appear in these spaces and the kinds of books people go to spaces to read, which I think is really inspiring as well.
I think something else too is to read diverse books in public, because whenever you're reading, people ask you, "What are you reading?" So then, any stranger who wants to talk to you, you can tell them.
I always try to recommend whenever somebody whenever I do an interview or whatever, I try to recommend books in that interview. Like to give a shout out to books that I think are important or books that I think people aren't reading but should at some point in the interview. Because that's like a mini ad, pass it forward type thing.
Yeah, I think, that's one of the great things about being an author is that as authors, we're not in competition with each other, because if you and I write similar books, a reader isn't going to say, oh, I'm going to read her book but not his book. They're going to say, I'm going to read her book and his book. And that creates this great community. We're all trying to support each other. And so, on my Twitter feed, I post a lot about other books that I love and that I've just read and recommend other books because, what's that saying? A rising tide raises all ships or whatever. I think we're all kind of lifting each other up and supporting each other. And I think that's one of the great things about being in this writing community.
That must be a California saying. We never said that in Toronto. Never heard that.
What was that again?
It's a rising tide lifts all boats.
Oh,
There you go.
a rising tide lifts all boats.
I would just try to avoid creeper waves because they can pull you out into the ocean and kill you. That's what I learned since I moved here. Creeper waves.
So anything else? All right, well, yes. Networking.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Also, one of the
Hustle.
ways that you learn about other writers as an author, I have a community of writers because I go to literary events as a speaker. And I think that, that's also, going to other library events, like all the people who came here, that's awesome. Like going to these things and hearing what other people bring up and have to say is a way to connect to other people. Networking.
Well, I think also for all the teens in the room too, like tell adults when we're not doing a good job of this.
Nicely.
Tell all your teachers, and then you can blame me if they get mad at you. Tell them I told you to say that.
Yeah, I constantly tell our teens, adults are not always right just because they're adults.
Well.
I mean, other adults.
Okay, well, thank you everybody, and if you want to come take pictures of Jackie's really lovely handwriting.
That was really good.
Oh yeah, we'll put it on our Facebook page too.
Excellent.